the AI for Good Global Summit, convened by ITU, recognizes the joint responsibility of governments, the private sector, United Nations agencies, academia, and others to ensure AI reaches its full potential while preventing and mitigating harms.
And it's a moment that calls for action. And today I'm calling on each of you to use this summit to help the world to better understand what kinds of regulations, what kinds of guardrails we need to put in place right now. So together, let's make it innovative, let's make it safe, and let's make it responsible for all. Thank you very much.
Welcome to AI for Good, the leading action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by ITU, in partnership with 40 UN sister organizations, and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. In today's session, we're counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished panelists and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on exploring the role of open source artificial intelligence in standardizing digital public goods. It's a pleasure to have you all join us for what promises to be a very interesting and insightful discussion. Indeed, we stand at a pivotal moment in history where technology is reshaping every facet of our lives. Digital public goods, in short DPGs, are emerging as essential tools to achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. These DPGs can range from health information systems to educational platforms, and they are fundamentally about creating inclusive and scalable solutions that leave no one behind. However, as these systems grow, so do the challenges of ensuring interoperability, accessibility, and equity. This is where the incredible power of open source artificial intelligence comes into play. Open source AI indeed promises the flexibility, transparency, and community-driven innovation necessary to build standardized, adaptable, and impactful digital solutions for all. In today's webinar, we will thus delve into critical questions. How can open source artificial intelligence serve as a catalyst for empowering and standardizing digital public goods? What role can collaboration and policy play in scaling these solutions to reach low and middle income countries? How do we navigate the challenges of responsible artificial intelligence development while ensuring accessibility and affordability? We are today fortunate to have a panel of esteemed experts with us who bring a wealth of experience from diverse domains, including artificial AI, artificial intelligence development, policy frameworks, and global development. I would like to invite our panelists to switch their camera on to say hello. We'll start first with Carlo Piana, board member of the Open Source Initiative, OSI. We'll then discuss with Amreen Taneja, standards lead at the DPGA, the Digital Public Goods Alliance. We'll then hear some insightful information from Hussein Hadi, head of publishing at ISO. And we'll conclude with David Forden, our open source artificial intelligence project manager at ITU. Together, we'll explore the intersections of technology, policy, and collaboration to understand how open source artificial intelligence can accelerate progress towards the SDGs. But before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank AI for Good for hosting this webinar and providing a platform to exchange ideas and insights. I also want to thank each of you for joining us today. Your interest and engagement are vital to advancing these conversations and turning them into action. So without further waiting, let me introduce our first speaker, Carlo Piana, who will enlighten us on the compelling developments that took place recently at the Open Source Initiative. So I would like to invite Carlo to join the conversation and the other panelists to switch their cameras off just the time for this exchange to take place. So Carlo, welcome to this panel.
Pleasure.
So we had a number of interesting news recently at the Open Source Initiative. So we know that you recently achieved the milestone with the Open Source AI definition, OSAID. Could you explain to us the major underlying concepts of this definition and how they aim to address the unique challenges posed by AI, particularly in the context of digital public goods and SDGs?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me in the first place. The open source AI definition was a collective effort. It was not the opinion of Open Source Initiative. We facilitated a dialogue, a public forum, inviting many people to have their say, not just the usual suspect, those who are vocal on every matter, but people who are not familiar with Open Source Initiative. We have had a reaching out activity to people who are not really interacting, or people who are not really familiar with the open source concept. Surprisingly, many people from academia or from NGOs, and we try to expand also our geographic reach to Africa, Asia, and other South America areas who are not actively involved in many times in the public discourse. So the idea was roughly to replicate the same success story of open source software, but having a different, much different beast like AI is. So deriving the same rules for open source wouldn't be a non-starter because it's much different. So the very analogy with open source software is totally unproductive. So we need to abstract to get higher level and distill what really matters for open source. What is the essence, not just the rule, the practical rule, but the essence. So first, open source is a means to an end. In the end is achieving frictionless, permissionless innovation. What we call standing on the shoulder of giants. And at the bottom of it, what enables this frictionless innovation is the 4 freedoms. Therefore, this is why we have the 4 freedoms at the very beginning of the definition. It's front and center of it. But here gets the difference with the open source definition, because the open source definition mainly deals with licenses, so the permission, the legal part, and that's why I am a lawyer. I'm very much involved into it. Whereas with open source AI, we don't even know what is the if there is any rights or that controls a model, for instance. So we needed to make practical rules to make sure that this would become a digital public good, because there is a lot of technical matters to be considered. So the most evident obstacle and challenge was to define what is a preferred means to modify, to study and modify the system and the components thereof. So and the other challenge was that the technology is evolving very rapidly, and the understanding of it is not there is a lot of different ideas, and these are especially for data the role of data in creating an open source AI model. So from what we gather very soon is that the real source, the real secret source is not necessarily the data, but is the software used to generate the model. This is the part that many refuse or are very wary of sharing, because that's what provides the most important bit. So in addition, it's not black and white as in software. In software, either you have the source code or you don't have anything. So you don't have any means to adapt and modify the software. With AI, it's different. So you have meaningful interaction through different methods. So many say, oh, it's open source because I can use the model, slap a RAG on it, or provide context, and voila, it works magically. We wanted something different, something higher quality. And we wanted to have the same kind of interaction, the same kind of meaningful change that we have for software. That includes even redoing everything from scratch. And so we require availability of all the major components, including software model parameters and shareable data. On the top of it, one of the aim of our effort is to have a common vocabulary on what is open source AI, because especially now that in Europe, at least, we have an open source exception to some of the rules of the AI Act. We lack a good definition, because the definition that is embedded in the AI Act is falling short of its task. So we wanted to have certainty for people, and certainty to have a truly shareable digital public good.
Thank you very much, Carlo. That's very interesting indeed. I took note that indeed technology is rapidly evolving, and so should our understanding, and therefore it is absolutely vital to come up with some common terms and definitions for what we have ahead of us. Just to recall one of the aspects that you just shed light on, one of the persistent challenges of open source AI is ensuring the availability of training data sets for transparency, explainability, and auditability purposes. Could you tell us more on how does this OSI framework address issues like licensing, responsible considerations, and accessibility of data sets to facilitate such transparency while maintaining compliance with privacy and intellectual property regulations?
Yes, this is of course the major source of internal debate. Even at OSI, we had a lot of difficulties. We of course value access to data. The widest, the fullest access to data is an important part of transparency. But on the other hand, we are very conscious that data is different from software. Sharing software is simple to a point. Sharing data means a lot of many things on the top of it. And I refer to personal data, medical data, imagery of medical records. This is very valuable, important to many meaningful users of AI, and not allowing or requiring this sharing would be for us too much of a requirement. So we required that between the two opposite position, data is totally unimportant and data sharing is absolutely requirement. We disagree with both. The solution we found is to require sufficient information, including all the shareable data sets. And for the part which is not shareable, we nonetheless require the full description of the data used for training, their sources, so traceability, so provenance, how how the data have been obtained, how they have been selected and labeled, the processing and filtering. So it's a lot of things that we required, and of course, sharing the data which are shareable. We believe that this will not be sufficient to reproduce an AI model, provided that it's very uncertain that reproducibility in AI works as it's, but this is not a requirement for open source either. So that's a red herring for those requiring that. But it will be sufficient to create a substantially equivalent one. So you, of course, need to go and fetch data, the same data, other data, but you have a full explanation, and you have scientifically equivalent, not equivalent, but balanced with the opposite, the opposite requirement. And mostly, if we required sharing the data, we would miss out one very important tool, which is text and data mining exception in Europe, which allows people to access and use data, but not to share. Unfortunately, not to share them. So.
Thank you, Carlo. I think it's well understood that there is a fragile equilibrium to find in making some of the training data sets available for reproducibility purposes, especially when it comes to sensitive data, because those data are regulated. If you took the example of the EU AI Act, so in Europe there is also the GDPR, the General Data Protection Rule, which certainly could constrain how much of your training data sets you could share depending on the actual AI use case at stake. So it's understandable. And so my understanding from what you just said is that you've secured the minimal conditions required in a general open source AI definition, allowing a third party to try and reproduce the AI training process in sufficient conditions to make it studyable, which is one of the four major freedoms of the open source. And I do believe this is a very good beginning, and maybe there's got to be in the future new regulations to help with further opening, or at least making access easier for those entitled third parties to study an AI system. Thank you very much, Carlo. That's really insightful, and I think this leads us to our second speaker and associated compelling requirements for digital public goods. So I would like to welcome Amreen Tanisha. Hi, Amreen.
Hi, David. How are you? Pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure for us too, and I think that your points are going to be complementary to those of Carlo on the OSI. So I would like to ask you a question which is more specifically related to digital public goods. So what key elements of the current digital public goods standard, because there is a standard that you can elaborate on, that properly and precisely defines what qualifies as a digital public goods. But this standard's been recently extended or updated. So, and it's been done so for coping with open source artificial intelligence. So could you tell us how might these changes better align with DPGs and SDGs, in particular SDG 9, which is about the emphasis on technology and innovation in developing countries?
Right. So this is a great question. And, one we've been focusing on in the updates to the DPG standard for AI systems. And so for those of you who are new to the DPG standard, I'd just like to share briefly that this is essentially a standard based on the definition of digital public goods as defined by the Secretary General of the United Nations. And the DPGA Secretariat, in fact, operationalizes the DPG definition. through the DPG standard, which is a set of 9 indicators that establishes the requirements that must be met in order to earn recognition as a digital public good. The DPG standard assesses open source solutions, so like open source software, open data sets, open content collections, and open AI systems as DPGs, right? And we often say that DPGs are actually open source plus plus, right? Because in order for a solution to become a digital public good, in addition to having an open license, the solution should actually fulfill many other criteria as well, right? So it should be platform independent. It should adhere to standards and best practices. There should be a mechanism in the solution for extracting the data. They must not do any harm by design, right? So in terms of having mechanisms to ensure data privacy and security, to prevent inappropriate and illegal content, and also the fact that, the solution should have mechanisms to ensure protection from harassment as well. So as AI continues to evolve, it's essential that we ensure that specifically for AI DPGs, they not only adhere to our existing principles of openness and transparency, but then we also address the unique aspects of AI systems. So I think, David, I'll just give you a few examples of the kind of changes that we're proposing to make in the DPG standard. And I'm using the word propose here because the DPG standard is essentially an open standard, right? And as per its governance processes, any minor, major, or fundamental change to the standard has a community input period, essentially. And on the basis of that, all these decisions are finalized. So it's really, in a way, by the community and for the community. So I'll share the first one, which is essentially about openness across AI components, right? So we've expanded the requirements for AI DPGs in that solutions will now need to provide documentation for source code, for model requirements, and open data. This means that essentially anyone, anywhere can access, they can adapt, and they can improve these systems, right? So, and for this purpose, in fact, we have introduced a fundamental change to the DPG standard, which is essentially talking about mandating training data for AI solutions who want to qualify as digital public goods, right? And in alignment with this, under indicator 5 of the DPG standard, which talks about documentation, we now require a detailed model card. We will be requiring data cards, data sheets for AI systems as well. And these documents, they essentially explain how AI models work, its intended use cases, and its limitations as well. And this is, of course, in addition to training data. So for model cards, it would contain use cases for intended uses and limitations, as well as performance of the model. And for data sheets, for instance, it would include use cases both suitable and unsuitable, and also sufficient information to recreate that data set. Then in the DPG standard, we also have a do no harm requirement, right? So I would also like to highlight the fact that as the DPGA, we focus only on the design and development of the DPGs, right? In the context of AI DPGs as well, therefore, we are going to assess if AI solutions are designed in a manner that mitigates harm, right? So there is a fine balance to be maintained there in terms of what really falls under the ambit of design versus what falls under the ambit of implementation, right? Then thirdly, we are also going to be making some major changes under indicator 8 of the standard, which talks about adherence to applicable standards and best practices. This will essentially have 2 additional requirements that we're going to propose. One is adherence to responsible AI best practices, and another is an AI risk assessment, which we have created that essentially looks into aspects like proportionality, bias and fairness, transparency, mitigation, so on and so forth. So I can maybe give you a few examples of the kind of questions that will be asked as a part of this. So for proportionality, one of the questions that we're currently considering is, what is the potential impact of AI systems on people, including vulnerable groups? and those who are affected indirectly in context of which it was developed essentially, and how could this model or how could the system affect these groups positively and negatively. And in terms of bias and in terms of fairness as well, one of the questions that we're considering is around, whether the developers have really thought about what are the potential biases that could be encoded in the AI system itself, and what are the steps that they have taken to monitor this, to mitigate it, or to address these biases, right? And these are essentially some of these updates. They align perfectly with SDG 9, which focuses on fostering innovation and building infrastructure in developing countries. Because by prioritizing open and transparent systems, we in a way are lowering the cost as well as the expertise barriers for these countries. And this makes it easier for them to adopt the AI technology, adapt them to their context, and also use them to address pressing challenges, from improving healthcare to enhancing education. So yeah, I mean, in short, I think these updates will ensure that AI DPGs are not just tools of innovation, but they're tools of inclusive innovation.
Thank you very much, Amreen. It's very interesting to have a summary of the various and the many changes or updates to the DPG standard that are actually helping to better frame and guide open source AI-based DPG developments. Just to understand how this standard can evolve, could you tell us more about the mechanisms that ensure that open source AI solutions remain inclusive and accessible for under-resourced countries while maintaining this alignment with international responsible and technical norms? How is DPGA structured to ensure that future evolutions will still ensure inclusivity and accessibility?
Right. So this is a critical question again, and one that really resonates deeply with the purpose of the DPG standard itself, right? Because, see, our hypothesis is that there will inevitably be trade-offs to navigate. For instance, we've recognized the importance of hearing more perspectives from the global majority, especially on how open data, which is also a dedicated category of DPGs, how that really plays a crucial role as an input factor for public interest AI as well, right? And this input is, in fact, essential if we want to develop AI solutions that truly reflect the needs and realities of under-resourced settings, especially in the context of digital public goods. And for those who may not be familiar, DPGA is a multi-stakeholder initiative, right? So we have about 47 members. And many of these members are, in fact, already focused on enhancing the technical capacity of under-resourced countries and providing training, to make AI and open data solutions more accessible. This work in itself is invaluable, right? But as the Secretariat, our responsibility is essentially to ensure that the standard itself evolves to support these needs more directly. So one way that we are doing this is by advancing the inclusion of open data DPGs as well as AI DPGs in the registry. So the idea is that by prioritizing solutions, that emphasize open data as a foundational element, we can make these technologies more accessible and relevant to global majority contexts. And this approach, I would say, it doesn't just highlight existing solutions, but then it also creates a pathway for deployment and adaptation in diverse contexts, in fact. So also, in fact, this ties closely to the call for collaborative action that we just launched at our DPG annual members meeting a few weeks back. And this is a call that essentially makes identifying, preparing, and using existing open data at scale easier, right? So it's a collective effort, and I think we'll have more updates on this next year, so stay tuned for that as well. Yeah, and additionally, I think I'd like to mention that, like I was also, telling Hussein earlier, the DPG standard is more like a meta standard, right? And it's different from the technical standards developed by ISO. In fact, like I mentioned in the first part of the question, I think one of the requirements under Indicator 8 is actually adherence to relevant standards and best practices, right? So we'll be looking to ISO to perhaps explore the relevant OpenAI standards that are created by them that we can fit under this category as well. Because this also then ensures that all of our work here in this ecosystem, it's well aligned while also addressing the unique needs that public interest AI is currently presenting us. And yeah, I think finally, I would also like to emphasize the role of AI DPGs in democratizing AI systems. So, because these solutions, they are not just about being open source. They represent much more. They are essentially about creating a foundation where open data, ethical considerations, accessibility, all these things come together to ensure that AI systems serve the global majority. And so I think by fostering collaboration, by building capacity, and refining the DPG standard like we are doing now, we can really collectively ensure that these mechanisms work effectively together.
Thank you very much, Shamrin. It's really interesting. I like the term meta standard because indeed, when it comes to artificial intelligence, and it's, I think, even more true for open source artificial intelligence, you're touching upon a number of aspects, from opening of or opening access to data to open source models and data ingestion technologies. So you're indeed trying to align a number of things. And so I think the term meta standard is very interesting and does well describe the reality that you're facing. I also took note of this call for action. So I guess this is something we could find more information about on the DPGA website, and certainly you will have some news in the next couple of months, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So thank you very much, and that's also a very good transition to our next speaker, Hussein Adi from ISO, because we've heard about meta standard, we've heard about general open source AI definition. Now, what's the reality about standardization? So, Hussein, could you give us an overview of standardization frameworks as of today and how that might evolve? How can international standardizations organizations like ISO adapt their frameworks to ensure AI-driven open source solutions for DPGs are effective in diverse regulatory environments, particularly in the Global South?
Thank you very much. And I like the term meta standard as well. I see that as a bridge across the broader standards ecosystem. And of course, various ISO and IEC standards address aspects that can impact DPGs in areas such as quality, security, interoperability, and data governance. So just to give a few examples, if we're talking about data management and governance, we talk about ISO IC 21878, which has ethical considerations in data management. If we're talking about open data standards, we have ISO TS 8000 on data quality, talking about guidelines for ensuring high quality data in public resources. If we're talking about security, a key one would be ISO IC 27001 on establishing requirements for robust information security. If we're talking about software development and quality, an example of collaboration across different organizations, we have ISO IEC IEEE 12207 on systems and software engineering. If we're referring about the interoperability and open standards, we'd say ISO IC 2382 on IT vocabulary, promoting clarity in IT terms, and making sure there's consistency. If we're talking about open AI, what do we mean, and where do other standardized terms come into play? And of course, from our perspective, we're talking about AI. And a really good starting point I would strongly recommend is ISO IEC 22989, which is AI concepts and terminology. That offers a foundation for AI elements. That's a freely available standard, and it covers key concepts to ensure that consistency. So I'll talk a little bit about AI standards and then how ISO is collaborating with other standards organizations and where that collaboration might lead to in the future. So the first thing to say, I will highlight ISO IEC JTC1 SC42 is our committee responsible for developing AI standards. I'm very much active in foundational AI standards, big data, use cases, governance, testing, ethical, and societal concerns. At the moment, there are 33 published standards, 36 under development. The good news about ISO IEC SC42 is that they have workshops at least twice a year that are open to the public. So you can either look up ISO IEC SC42, and you can either go through the IEC Academy or you can go through the ISO website as well. These workshops are freely available. You can register where they talk about the latest developments in AI and how that impacts standards. Recently, they've covered healthcare, they've covered media. So those are freely available workshops, which I would invite people to join. When it comes to taking a holistic approach to creating AI standards, SC42, you could say, is the glue between requirements and technical requirements through the platform of horizontal deliverables, which is a mouthful of saying we consider the context. We look at the regulation, policy, and domain-specific needs. We translate the above into technical requirements, and that creates a platform of foundational horizontal standards that communities can leverage. What we're trying to do here is provide a forum for innovation that animates an ecosystem of partners. And collaboration here is very much with the United Nations, with the OECD, the WTO digitalization panel. And I would say key standards, as I mentioned before, the foundational standard on 22989, looking at artificial intelligence concepts and terminology. We've also got a standard on AI use cases, beneficial AI systems, trustworthiness in AI, that's ISO IEC TR 24028. We've also got bias in AI systems and AI-aided decision-making, which is ISO IEC TR 24027. So there's a number of standards here that come into play. But in this broader ecosystem, how do we make sure that we don't have duplication? How can we make sure that there's consistency within the AI standards ecosystem? And I will say that a really positive development was the 2025 International AI Standards Summit, which will take place in December in Korea. That was announced at the 5th Global Standards Symposium in India during a special session dedicated to the crucial role of standards in ensuring safe, responsible, and inclusive use of AI. This joint initiative by IEC, ISO, and ITU advances the UN's framework for global governance of digital technology and AI, the Global Digital Compact. And I would say the Governing AI for Humanity report that came out recently was a brilliant overview of all the AI standards, and it encapsulated that commitment to collaboration across these standards organizations. And a clear example of that, it's not just words, was the collaboration on AI watermarking, multimedia authenticity, and deepfake detection, which was announced at the AI for Good conference. Now, that's a very positive example of these organizations working together. So, and to answer the final part of the question, if we want to ensure that there's consensus, that there's collaboration here, we really need to make sure that there's involvement from all stakeholders. So that's an open invitation to join those workshops, an open invitation to take part in the standards development process, and important for us to continue that dialogue at the AI Standards Summit and to follow the call that the UN made, that we have to collaborate.
Thank you very much, Hussein. That's really interesting to have precise pointers to these various standards and to see the vibrant standardization activities that are taking place. I also took note of this very interesting AI Standards Summit that's going to take place next year. I think
end of this year, actually. Yeah.
End of this year. Okay.
Yes.
So that's really interesting to see how much activities is ongoing. So one additional question to you. So what are the main challenges your appreciation in integrating responsible dimensions of AI, such as transparency, accountability, inclusiveness, explainability into standards for digital public goods, and how might collaboration with open source initiatives help address them? I'm asking this more at a higher level because these are terms that are difficult to turn into actual technical standards. So what are your views on that?
It's definitely a challenge. I mean, look, one thing we're trying to do is have consistency in messaging, consistency in terminology, as you rightly said. And what confuses, muddies the waters, that you have multiple, let's say, global governance initiatives, whether it's OECD, whether it's the UN, multiple conferences. But one thing I think we can agree on is that there are overarching principles here that are important. You know, when we're talking about bias in the data, consistency and quality. So one of the key things here is making sure that, you know, there are challenges of lack of unified standards, the sheer complexity of AI systems, the fact that regulation struggles to keep up with the pace of change. You know, we're talking about generative AI's third wave with video and audio, and the fact that, you know, the EU AI Act only came into force in August, and, you know, China has already been doing some regulations. The US, there might be a change of direction with the new administration, but there's definitely a challenge here. And I think one of the key things when it comes to standards is it's hard to keep to stay ahead of the pace of technology change. And regulation is quite slow to catch up. So what you're really talking about is creating a culture of safety, creating that culture of managing risk. So for example, in our case, ISO IEC 42001 is a management system standard for managing risk in AI systems. And I think that's the kind of culture we want to bring forward, which is you may not be able to stay abreast of the speed of technology. It's very complicated. There are differences across different frameworks when it comes to regulation, when it comes to how things are approached. But what we can all agree on is that there are basic good housekeeping rules across any organization, open source or otherwise, in managing risk, in creating those internal governance mechanisms to ensure that we are monitoring and making sure that we're mindful of risks, whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's data. It's creating that culture. So I think we're trying to emphasize the importance of good risk management practice here, creating those frameworks that can survive even though the technology moves so quickly. And we need to make sure that everyone's involved here. This can't be a discussion being had at the World Economic Forum or OECD or otherwise. I think here standards organizations can act as that neutral bridge. And this is why I'm so grateful for the collaboration that we have with ITU, with IEEE and IEC. That's very important.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Hussein. That's really an interesting statement indeed. Success of responsible in AI in the future is to create such a culture of safety in managing risks. And so to remain mindful of what may happen with these technologies advancing so fast. So just before turning to David Forden, one last very small question that's more for the joke to you, saying, so SC42, is that a direct reference to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy?
The answer is 42. You know what? Yeah. I think it's accidental, but I think we'll take credit for that. But
yeah, it's a good one. All right, thank you, Hussein. So I'd like to turn to David Forden, project manager at ITU, presently working on a very interesting project that is developing a reference implementation for open source artificial intelligence, especially for the Global South. So, David, without waiting further, I'd like to ask you more about this initiative. Could you tell us what are the key milestones, deliverables of this open source artificial intelligence reference implementation? How do you envision it contributing to the broader standardization of open source AI for digital public goods?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me on, David, and very pleased and proud to be here. So, to sort of start with answering that question, the first major thing that we're trying to do is develop a core framework And that really involves establishing OSAI as a reference architecture, which is modular for implementing the AI-driven DPGs and emphasizing really some of the non-functional aspects like scalability, interoperability, and also localization, which is very important to the initiatives in the Global South. So our focus for the backbone of the reference architecture incorporates an open source project called OPIA, or the Open Platform for Enterprise AI. And that's a key open source framework that targets the delivery of very scalable open enterprise AI solutions. So part of the framework we're looking at as well is hosting this in and around the GovStack project, which has been worked on in place in the ITU for I think over nearly 5 years now. So we're looking at that for hosting the periphery and all the surrounding infrastructure. So the actual deliverable we're looking at with this is a fully documented and openly accessible framework for deploying AI-driven DPGs, specifically targeting retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, for the first phase. So the reason for this approach is so that we can build the capacity in countries for delivery of scalable, secure, flexible Gen AI solutions in a very cost-effective and repeatable manner to align with the objectives of the DPGs. So our vision is to extend this framework to address alternative aspects of AI solutions ongoing. So part of what we're doing is a couple of pilot implementations. So essentially deploying OSAI in critical sectors like healthcare and government services in collaboration with partners is quite critical. We have a large working group, and we've made significant progress toward defining use cases, defining the architecture, and defining the priorities going forward immediately. And we're now working in more detail with organizations such as GIZ and Gavi to frame the implementation details of some of the high-value use cases. We've got extensive documentation already available on our Confluence portal. So if anyone's interested in looking through that, just let me know and I'll forward you in the right direction. So the deliverable around that pilot implementation is essentially a set of well-documented use cases with all the data-driven insights into practical challenges and the solutions, along with the well-aligned solution architecture deployed in a sandbox. So we can use that sandbox to deliver multiple use cases ongoing. And initially, we're going to deliver pilot implementations for both a critical healthcare use case and a government services discovery solution with our key partners. So in terms of standardization, given what we've just heard from my esteemed colleague, Hussein, there's a very vast and emerging landscape of standards that are being set by organizations like ISO and even the ITU itself. So we have a very broad intention to align as closely as possible with those evolving standards. I couldn't honestly recite all the standards that Hussein cited earlier on, but one that came to note for me is the ISO IEC 23053 for AI systems standard. So we're looking at aligning with that directly. Obviously, the ITU, we have the AI for Good standards and also GovStack to align with, as well as some of the emerging standards from OSI and obviously the IEEE. So we're actually working with the IEEE presently on trying to put something a bit more concrete together going forward. So watch this space. At the moment, we're working with the OPIA project to help them extend their framework with the various required capabilities that are aligned to our joint goals. So essentially, we'll be extending that framework into areas that perhaps involve agentic approaches to interfacing with repositories of data that are more aligned with the government, as well as other things that are going to need to be in place in order to implement inferencing around the specific data scenarios for the use cases we're delivering. So then what is kind of a deliverable in that side is the technical specifications and the compliance guides for DPG implementers globally. And essentially, what this is going to do is provide the means for them to drive successful implementations of the framework and the many and varied use cases that are based on the reference implementation. In terms of evaluation and impact metrics, we're incorporating AI tools to monitor and evaluate DPG performance against international benchmarks, such as the SDG standards. And our vision is to incorporate the metrics and dashboards into the deployment framework for each use case in a standardized manner. So that'll enable us to have an ongoing evaluation and monitoring framework deployed with each project. So the deliverable in this case is a suite of assessment tools enabling real-time compliance and effectiveness tracking built into the framework and the specs. So in terms of contribution to the broader standardization community, we see interoperability as a very key aspect of what we're doing, and our adherence to open standards in that context ensures compatibility across obviously a very diverse and emerging technical ecosystem. We are also adopting standards of the GovStack project because that's something that's concrete that enables us to ensure compatibility with the broader work that's been accomplished by that project to deliver digital public goods. And for example, we're going to be leveraging the existing GovStack infrastructure, which is essentially Kubernetes based, along with the security, registry, and information mediation building blocks. In terms of global collaboration, obviously, we're going to need to put a bit more effort in or focus in that area. And we believe our approach facilitates input from the underrepresented regions in the global south, where we need to drive inclusivity, we need to drive standardization processes, and that with a very specific focus on underserved languages. So essentially, our goal is to really accelerate innovation, and our initiatives are there to provide a blueprint for really integrating Gen AI into the public service delivery, accelerating the adoption of best practices worldwide. So I hope that answers the question fairly well, David.
It does so, and actually you've been quite exhaustive and could address my second question on how this development could help mitigate technical and resource barriers in such developing countries. So it's so my understanding is that this is quite an interesting work. So you're basically working on a core framework, implementing existing open source technologies to help coming up with a computationally low demanding reference implementation of an open source artificial intelligence. And you're doing so by partnering with a number of important stakeholders. And I understood as well that by reusing concepts and de facto standards such as the sandbox and GovStack, you are making it much easier for countries to get started with open source artificial intelligence with an off-the-shelf reference implementation. So that's, I think, really key to indeed making it possible for countries to uptake your reference implementation and get started with it.
Yeah, I think that frames it really well, David. So obviously top of mind for us is, based on some of the principles we discussed earlier in the webinar, so accessibility and affordability of the solutions. And obviously to ensure that accessibility and affordability happens, we're adopting open source as a foundation. So, leveraging open source really ensures cost-effective adoption by eliminating proprietary licensing fees, making AI technology much more accessible, even to countries that are in a resource-constrained or resource-limited situation. So part of that in our mind as well is having accessible pre-built modules. So providing like a pre-configured low or no-code AI module that reduces the technical barrier for non-specialized teams is a really specific goal for us. And an example of that is, perhaps enabling chatbots for public services or predictive analytics tools in education that can be deployed with very minimal expertise. So we'll also be providing all the components necessary to integrate with the broader GovStack framework, which is actually going to further lower the cost and risk of such projects. So part of this as well, obviously, is localized data integration. So part of the problem space we're addressing there is ensuring that the framework supports local languages, local dialects, and the local data sets as well to improve the relevance and effectiveness of the solutions. An example of that would be perhaps an AI-driven digital classroom for remote learning in an underserved region with an underserved language. That's not one of the specific use cases that we're implementing right now, but just an example of what could be done. Another kind of element of this is really the deployment side. So we're looking at various different options because every country or every region is going to have its constraints in terms of hardware and infrastructure. So obviously we want to be able to support like a cloud native type implementation as well as hybrid options. So This enables deployment on both a centralized cloud infrastructure and localized on-premise systems. So that accounts for issues like bandwidth, like privacy, like specific legislation, and enables better choice for governments. So kind of capping that off is really about building capacity. So the big part about this for us is incorporating all the training and capacity building into the community and ensuring the engagement programs are in place to build those technical skills in AI and all the deployment and maintenance that's required for ongoing success. And we believe this really aligns with the ITU's goals. So firstly, affordability, which is, as I stated earlier, about open source components and ensuring that modular deployment at lower cost of adoption. Then accessibility, so ensuring that we have real-time assessment tools to ensure that there's an inclusive service delivery happening and identifying and addressing the gaps in the public access. And then scalability. So obviously, a lot of these solutions are going to be required to address a large population of citizens. And we really need an adaptable solution that can scale to meet the local conditions in some of those countries and support a long-term sustainable growth. So essentially, I'm a big believer in the OSAI framework, and it represents to me a very, very pivotal step in democratizing AI for public good. And it does so by aligning very well with international standards, addressing the critical barriers, and helping us to build an ecosystem where even the most resource-constrained nations can actually harness the potential of AI to drive progress on the SDG standards. So, for example, quality education, decent work and economic growth, as well as industry innovation and infrastructure. So I believe those are standards 4, 8, and 9, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep. Yeah. Thank you very much, David. That's really interesting, and to hear your passion about this particular development, which I believe will indeed have an important impact and be of really high interest for developing countries and within ITU as well. With this, we have just 3 minutes left for the Q&A. I didn't see much questions from the neural network chat. So let me just invite our panelists to switch their cameras on so we can be all together. Just to mention, there is a comment from Ursula Marchlevich from WIPO that has in the chat provided pointers to interesting body of work that they've carried out in their model and standards for open source artificial intelligence in some of the SDGs they are tackling. So I do encourage the audience to go have a look and check. I don't see any further questions from the audience, so maybe it's the right time to conclude. So as we reach the conclusion of today's thought-provoking discussion, and I do thank you all for your insightful points, let me take a moment to summarize some of the key insights that emerged from these exchanges. So we've heard about the OSAID definition and the difficulty of finding a good compromise between openness, transparency, and the issues related with actual training data sets. We heard that the definition has been worked as a community-driven effort to come up to gear towards something that allows ensuring that one can reproduce AI training in good conditions to understand the AI outcomes. We've heard about the DPG standard and the notion of a meta standard as we are tackling a number of issues when coming to open source artificial intelligence. And that is really interesting to see how it materializes, how it shapes in the DPG standard update. We also had a very detailed synthesis of various standards and that were identified by Hussein from ISO and from some other standardization organizations that do help moving forward with open source artificial intelligence. We discussed about the responsible AI as a culture to cope with risks management in the future, to remain mindful about AI evolutions and unanticipated use cases. And we had as a concluding speaker, David Forden from ITU, talking about an interesting reference implementation open source artificial intelligence under development presently with a number of experts. We didn't talk about the community, but I think it's a growing community with more than 50 contributors from about a good dozen agencies. So it's also a very interesting development that could help paving the way forward for standardizing AI in the future. So with this, I would like to really warmly thank you all for your contribution to this discussion. It was really interesting, and I'm really pleased that you could accept our invitation to join. This webinar will be followed up by a publication. We are presently working on a nice piece of work that will talk about open source artificial intelligence and the goodness of it for developing digital public services. So we'll talk about digital public goods, about the issues and challenges associated with open source artificial intelligence. We'll dig into some specific sectors to then conclude with some implementations and lessons learned from these efforts. But also we'd like to have a nice section on standardization efforts. So I would like to invite you all to contribute after this webinar to this publication that we aim to consolidate by the end of this year and publish during the first trimester next year. So thank you to all of you. Let's keep the conversation going beyond today's webinar as we work together to create a more equitable digital future. Stay tuned for upcoming events, and let's continue to drive innovation with purpose. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learned something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the eShop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for Good.
The AI for Good Global Summit, convened by ITU, recognizes the joint responsibility of governments, the private sector, United Nations agencies, academia, and others to ensure AI reaches its full potential while preventing and mitigating harms.
And it's a moment that calls for action. And today I'm calling on each of you to use this summit to help the world to better understand what kinds of regulations, what kinds of guardrails we need to put in place right now. So together, let's make it innovative, let's make it safe, and let's make it responsible for all. Thank you very much.